Hello, and welcome to the Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. My name is Ryan, and I am a self-proclaimed Calvin and Hobbes superfan and expert.
And my name is also Ryan, although most people call me Indy.
As we continue our celebration of 40 years of Calvin and Hobbes, today we'll be discussing Hobbes' Pouncing, and because we're awesome, we have titled this episode Pouncing Tiger, Hidden Calvin.
Yeah, I gotta say, I love that title.
Yeah, it hit me like a bolt of lightning, just this stroke of inspiration. It's probably because I'm a genius like Calvin.
That's probably why. Did
Yeah.
you actually hook your head up to the cranial enhancitron to do that?
Yeah, that's what it was. I have the cardboard box just sitting in the other room. So,
And the colander, I assume.
well, yeah, you can't do that without a colander.
Okay, that's true. All right. Yeah.
Yeah,
How silly of me to even point it out.
yeah.
All right.
But
Yeah. All right. Well done.
thanks. Before we get into that, though, we got to give our disclaimer that we're not affiliated with Bill Watterson or his syndicate, so we can't display any of the comics that we discuss. But of course, we'll give you the dates of publication so you can look them up on Go Comics if you have a subscription. We'll also give the page numbers of each book that they're in so you can look them up if you have the books. All right, so before we get into this episode, we did get another email, so I think we should take a minute to acknowledge that. So this is from Michael, and the subject line is Love the show. I have some comments. And Michael says, Hi guys, I'm absolutely loving the show. The past couple of years, I start out the new year by rereading all the Calvin and Hobbes books, which great
Awesome.
tradition.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
I like
approve.
that. Yeah, absolutely. He says, This year, after I finished my reread, I decided to look for podcasts on the greatest comic ever, which is how I found your awesome show. Thank you.
Yes.
He says that he hasn't listened to every single episode yet, and that's wonderful. You have more to enjoy. I'm savoring them, so my notes below might already have been mentioned, but I wanted to share two things.
Oh, so he's giving us some ideas then.
Yeah, exactly. So he says in the episode where we mention Calvin equating Mercury with flowers, that he says, to me, that's a joke about FTD, which I guess is a specific floral
Yeah,
seller. Yeah.
I think Calvin mentions them, doesn't he? He says
Yeah.
that's why he's the registered trademark of FTD florists.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I didn't realize that that was a specific brand. I thought that was like a type of florist, like I don't know,
Oh, okay.
part of an association or something. But I guess they're a specific brand. So he says they were, possibly still are, a floral company, and their logo depicts Mr. Mercury himself, which I did not know. So that's
All
interesting.
right.
Yeah. So that's how I read that part by Calvin. He would be familiar with their commercials from all his TV watching. Yeah, good point. And then his other comment is, in your winter episode, I have a thought on the elaborate snow creations. To me, what we see in them in the comic strips isn't reality. Like a lot of other aspects of CNH, we're seeing things through Calvin's perspective. So his unlikely snow creations don't actually look that way to anyone but him. When his parents comment on his snowmen, they can tell what he's going for, but it doesn't actually look like it's depicted. Sort of how, like, when his young daughter makes a snowman to her, it's way more elaborate than what he perceives. So I think that's an interesting thought. I like the idea of Calvin as some sort of art savant, but I think this idea makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and it could even be somewhere in the middle, right? Like
Sure.
maybe Calvin's good enough to make it where people can generally see what it is, but it's not quite as detailed as we, the readers of the strip, see in the illustrations.
Yeah, well, and I was trying to think if there are any physics-defying snow sculptures where anyone other than Calvin and Hobbes are shown, and I'm actually not sure there are. Like that giant octopus one, I
That's the
can't
one that comes to
remember.
mind.
Yeah, I can't remember. Is Dad in that one? He might be.
I, I think so. 'Cause isn't that the one where he thinks, I don't think the schools assign enough homework?
Yeah, yeah, that might be right. So, yeah, and that one is pretty physics defying. But yeah, it could be that, it's still clearly an octopus holding a guy, but maybe it's not quite as elaborate as we see or something like that. I
Yeah,
think
maybe the
that's reasonable.
tentacles aren't so defined, and like maybe
Yeah,
there's more physical support than the lithe tentacle there or whatever.
yeah,
But that being said, Michael, that's also a very interesting idea, and it would very much be on brand for the strip. So
yeah,
we're
absolutely.
seeing what Calvin's imagination is and what he's seeing, not necessarily how anyone else perceives it, except maybe for Hobbes.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a perfectly reasonable take. And then Michael wraps up by saying, Thanks again for this fantastic show and keep up the great work. So thank you, Michael. We plan to. Appreciate your email.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. So great to hear from you.
With that, let's go ahead and talk about Hobbes pouncing on Calvin. So, first, I think we need to take a moment and talk about where that idea came from. And we talked about this before, I believe, in episode 2 about Hobbes, but just as a reminder, Watterson was a cat person. So, during the run of Calvin and Hobbes, he had at least 3 cats: Sprite, Juniper Boots, and Pumpernickel. And Sprite specifically was the one who apparently liked to charge at Watterson out of nowhere, and that was the inspiration for Hobbes pouncing. On a related side note, my wife had a cat who also liked to charge, and in his case, he liked to attack her ankles. And she says it was terrifying and that his eyes would actually get red. She describes it like, you know, how when there's a camera flash, your eyes can be red in the picture. It was kind of like that. And somehow that would happen when he was about to charge. And so I guess she had a demon cat.
Or a homicidal psycho jungle cat.
Yes, you could say that.
I think
Excellent
Hobbes'
reference.
eyes, do they turn red or they go some color, right? It might be green even.
There's one, yeah, where I think they show up green because cat's eyes will do that in the dark. Like if they catch the light right, you'll see their retinas reflecting back at you.
Okay. But still, like fairly reminiscent of Hobbes.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we'll come to that one, but that I believe that's the one where Calvin is talking about what early man must have felt like, and then he sees Hobbes sneaking up, or Hobbes has disappeared. There actually could be another one. We're gonna have to check on that because
Okay.
I get them conflated.
You're saying Hobbes pounces a lot.
It does come up quite a bit, as we will see. Yeah. Now, let me make another quick disclaimer here. There are strips where Calvin and Hobbes play football, and Hobbes pounces into Calvin as his way of tackling. And I'm not counting those when we're talking about Hobbes pouncing. Those will probably come up when we talk about sports and Calvin ball. So when we say in a moment how many strips there are of Hobbes pouncing, it won't count those. That would increase the number even further. But
I think that's right, because that's a specific context, which seems different from like Hobbes iconically pouncing on Calvin.
right, yeah, like in football, you kind of expect it. Like
Yeah.
you're going to get tackled if you're playing tackle football, and if it happens to come in the form of a pounce, so it's not a surprise.
I mean, arguably, a lot of tackles are fairly pounce-like anyway. So,
Right, yeah, Hobbes is just especially good at that version.
although, do you remember what he does instead of tackling in one instance?
Yeah, well, there's one where Calvin is running along and there doesn't seem to be any resistance, and then Hobbes pulls a rope and it says twang, and Calvin trips over it, and Calvin's like, "You're supposed to tackle me."
That seems so lowbrow,
Yeah.
which is kind of funny or ironic or something, given how often, as we've said, Hobbes does like to tackle Calvin. So I guess he gets over the feelings of lowbrowness at least most of the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, and maybe it's more fun when it's not football and he wants the element of surprise. Calvin's expecting the tackle, so
That's true. He does talk about how fun the element of surprise is.
yeah. So in this episode, we're going to stick to the ones where Hobbes pounces on Calvin or tries to pounce on Calvin by surprise for the most part. Now, when we did the Spaceman Spiff episode, I asked you how many Spiff strips you would guess there were, and it turned out there were about 65 to 70. So I'm going to give you the same question for Hobbes pouncing, again with the caveat that we're not counting the football ones. So how many strips would you guess there are of Hobbes pouncing? And I will say, I just flipped through my books and counted these, so it's possible I'm off by a little, but I think we'll be in the right ballpark.
Okay, ballpark. So I remember with the Spiff one, it seems like you and I both had guessed a higher number than there actually was. Like it seemed
Yeah.
more prevalent. Okay, so I was kind of leaning towards something like 87, but given what happened before where we were overestimating, I'm going to lower my guess. So let's say like 49.
Okay. Now, before I show you what I came up with, 87 is very specific. How did you come up with that number?
I don't know. It just kind of popped into
Just
my
popped in your
mind.
head? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So by my count, and I think I'm a little low, I counted 68. You just recently pointed out at least one that I missed. So I think we're in the ballpark of 70 again. So it's
Okay.
about the same number of pouncing strips as there are spiff strips. I think that's kind of interesting that those two coincide that closely.
Yeah, it is.
So,
Okay, and so, all right, so I successfully overshot and undershot it with my two guesses there. So that's fun.
well, if you average them, you get a little closer. So, I
That's
don't want to
true.
I don't want to do the math in my head, but you're probably about there. So we'll give
Yeah.
it to you. We'll say you got it.
Okay. Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. We should. I was exactly right. I think is what
Yes.
we learned here. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Well, all right. Kudos for Navigator Nebular.
Exactly.
That doesn't really make sense in context, but that's okay.
Yeah, but listeners, if you know what Indy's talking about, props to you. Now, I just want to bring up an interesting coincidence that I also noticed while I was flipping through counting all the pouncing strips. There are a lot of pouncing strips that are either really closely preceded or really closely followed, or sometimes both, by strips where Calvin has some confrontation with Mo. So it's a lot of times Calvin getting punched out of the frame or something like that. But I counted at least 11 instances where that's the case. So, it's not obviously it's not like it's every time there's a pouncing strip, there's also a Mo strip, but that's, I feel like, a significant percentage. And I just find that an interesting coincidence. It could be just that, just a coincidence. But I wonder if having Calvin get clobbered in one way made Watterson think of a strip where Calvin could get clobbered in another way.
Yeah, that is an interesting kind of fact there. It's not something I had noticed before. I mean, you could also speculate something about Calvin's psychology, right? Like, and again, this is
Mm,
sort of off the top of my head here, but like you could imagine, okay, here's Mo who sort of clobbers or sort of attacks him in just a purely mean way. Then you have Hobbes who pounces on him, and in one sense, it's mean, like Calvin doesn't like it, but as we'll see, there's also affection behind it.
right.
So it would almost be interesting if this was somehow Calvin kind of transforming the the enmity and the actions of Mo into something that's similar but actually positive in this
Yeah.
way. I don't
So,
know. Again, I'm not suggesting that like, oh, this was what Watterson was going for here, but it's sort of an intriguing idea, I think.
yeah, I don't know that that's what he was going for either. I think it could have just been,
Yeah,
I
it
got to
might
come up with
be.
a strip. But there's one strip that actually shows the affection that we'll talk about later. But in that strip, there's also an instance of Calvin being bullied by Mo, and then getting pounced on by Hobbes is the thing that makes Calvin's day get better. So I don't know, that almost specifically highlights like Mo is mean to me, and now here's Hobbes, and so I'm dealing with this. And
That's
I don't
true.
know that that's what Watterson had in mind, but you could read it that way.
Yeah, you could. Is that the one? I think it's raining too,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like,
Yep.
okay, the last shot is, yeah, he pounces on him, but the last frame is him. I think Calvin's actually upside down, but Hobbs is like hugging him to him with this like great smile on his face.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and then the next one is the last frame where his mom says good day and Calvin says getting better.
yeah,
So yeah. But let's back up to the beginning. So the first instance that I found, and I think it's the first instance overall because it's pretty early on, of Hobbes pouncing is from January of 1986. And it's a little different from the usual because in this one, Hobbes is attacking from above and Calvin yells, ah, tiger attack.
right. And interestingly, this is a just home from school pounce too, even though, like you pointed out, it's not sort of the classic one where he gets him at the door. Hobbs is waiting in his room, I think maybe on top of his bed, and then he jumps into the air, and
Yeah.
that's where we get this. And then that one ends too with one of my favorite lines in the strip. It's because they ended up kind of crashing around the house, and his mom gets mad and blames Calvin, of course. And then Calvin says, "You sissy, mom always takes your side." And he goes, "That's because she wanted another tiger, not you."
Yeah, which made me think of an interesting point because, again, when we did the episode on Hobbes, episode 2, we talked about the origin of Hobbes and like, did they have Hobbes before Calvin was born? And that one kind of gives some idea that mom had Hobbes first. I think maybe we even talked about that
I think
specifically in
we
that
did.
episode. Yeah, but it also made me think about there's at least one other strip that talks about I'm going to be kind of shady about this, or kind of like ambiguous. That talks about where Hobbes was before Calvin. Can you think
Okay.
of anything that addresses that?
Where Hobbes was before Calvin. So, and this, I think we talked about this again in episode 2, but Hobbes makes a reference to when Calvin was younger. So he remembers he spent most of his time burping up, which suggests that Hobbes was there when Calvin was a baby, which I think, as we talked about, especially along with this one, it gives credence to the idea that, yeah, Hobbes was there much longer than just what we see in the very beginning of the strip, and maybe even preceded Calvin. Like he could have been a baby shower gift or something. I don't know if that's what you're going for though, in asking like where Hobbes was exactly.
Yeah, it's not. I'm being sneaky here.
Okay.
I wanted to see how deep this rabbit hole could go. So I'll give you another clue. It involves Hobbes's family.
Ooh, Hobbes's family.
Yeah,
Let's. All right. So, okay, I know Hobbes refers to his dad at
yeah,
one point because he's saying, let's see, he's talking about, I think this is when he's trying to teach Calvin how to be a tiger. And
you're close.
yeah, and something comes up like, what would happen if a rhino charges at us? Or maybe this is even related to how to deal with Mo. It's like, here's what
Yeah,
we
there you
do
go.
when a rhino charges at us, and the answer is like, scramble like heck for the nearest tree. And he goes, like, it doesn't impress the girls, but then there's no sense impressing them and getting killed, my father used to say.
That's it. That's the one. You
Okay.
got it there.
All right.
Yeah,
That was a little bit of a deep cut. So that's a good reference. So you're,
yeah,
I mean, and there's at least one other time when Hobbes says something like, you can take the cat out of the jungle, but you can't take the jungle out of the cat. So this does suggest that Hobbes and his father apparently were in the jungle at some point before being with Calvin.
right. Yeah, and I guess that means Hobbes must be a Bengal tiger if there were rhinos around. So
Okay. All
yeah.
right, man. We are learning so much on this highly educational podcast, it turns out.
Yeah. So who knew that a podcast celebrating Calvin and Hobbes would be so rich with, I don't even know what it's rich with, but it's rich with something.
Zoological
Yeah,
fact.
there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of which, so do you remember what color Hobbes is?
Well, according to Hobbes, he's, I think I'm going to say this right, a yellow ochre more than a straight orange.
Yes, because that's when Calvin is going to make a picture of Hobbes. And so,
Yeah. And as long as we're riffing on this sort of thing, sorry, listeners, but this is what you get. So a few episodes back, you talked about uh, comics where there are two tigers pictured. I found a
okay.
couple more. You want to take a
Oh,
stab at it?
wow. Okay. All right. So the obvious ones obviously are when Calvin turned himself into a tiger. He
Uh-huh.
transmogrifies. We have both, and then I
Right.
pointed out on the cover of Scientific Progress Goes Boink, you see a framed drawing of a tiger that either Calvin or Hobbes must have done that is hanging up in Hobbes's room. Um, let's see. I know they go to the Natural History Museum and they see like a stuffed Bengal
Yeah, they
tiger.
see a saber-toothed tiger,
Oh, a
which
sable
isn't
tiger, right?
technically a tiger, but we could maybe kind of count that one.
Okay, although I'm not sure if Hobbes is actually in the panel in the same time as the
Yeah,
same
I'd have
tiger,
to
though.
double check on that. Could be.
Okay. And then there's one where Calvin is pretending to be a dinosaur and pretending Hobbes is a saber-toothed tiger. But again, I don't think we see two tigers at
No.
once. All right, I won't take too long trying to think about this. I'll just really quick try to think. Let's see. Assuming we're not counting when Calvin dresses up like a
No,
tiger.
not that one.
Okay. I know they visit the zoo and we see like a plaque by the tiger enclosure, but I don't think we
Yeah, we don't
see
see
any
any
actual tiger.
tigers.
Oh wait,
No.
okay. I do think I remember one. Let's see.
Okay.
Are they both in it though? There's one that's it might even be the one with the yellow ochre, but it starts off like showing it's like one of those how to draw things with a tiger. And
Yeah,
then
that's
Calvin's like, oh, I
one.
could do better than that.
Yeah, that shows like an outline like a stick figure tiger, and then a slightly more tigerish tiger, and then a actual tiger. So if you want to count that, but I've got a couple more. You want a
Okay.
hint?
Well, I think I'm coming up empty, and for the sake of our listeners, if nothing else, maybe I should stop guessing now. So,
Yeah.
yeah, what do you got?
All right. Well, so they both involve clay. So there's one where Calvin
Okay.
says he was gonna make like a fighter jet, but now I think it's a bowl because it wasn't working out. And Hobbes goes, "Oh yes, that's very good." And he's making this really intricate sculpture, basically of himself in this
Right.
ferocious position. And then
Okay.
the other one, the one where Hobbes says, "Smock, smock, 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 smock." Calvin makes a bunch of shrunken heads of popular cartoon characters. Hobbes makes a little clay tiger that he calls Symphony in Orange #1, and his
That's
mom
right.
wants to put it on the coffee table. So we see Hobbes in frame with each of those at one point. So
Okay.
there's
Good
another
call.
deep cut for you.
Nice. Yeah, no, I remember those. And then this is actually, I mean, to bring us back full circle, see, this was planned the entire time,
Yes,
just
we
like his
absolute
mother
listeners.
always takes Hobbes aside and supposedly wanted another tiger instead of Calvin. She also thought Hobbes' little clay tiger was great and much better than Calvin's shrunken heads of cartoon characters, I think with like their eyes or mouths sewn
Their
shut
mouths
or
stitched
something too.
shut. Yes.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
very creepy. So
She was repulsed.
yeah,
Rightly
so
so.
it all comes back to mom favoring Hobbes.
Yeah, there we go. Good job bringing it back. All right, listeners, we'll try not to have too many more detours. I make no promises, though. So, that first instance of Hobbes pouncing was in January of 86. The next one doesn't happen until almost a year later in December of 86. Well, actually, Indy, so you pointed this one out. I'll let you describe it
Oh,
for us.
sure. So this one is so Calvin. This is just a weird minor thing, I guess, but he says, "I'm home from school," instead of, I think, like every other sort of iconic pouncing strip, he just says, "I'm home,"
Yep.
which I don't know, fun fact, maybe because it's early. And
Yeah.
so then Hobbes pounces on him at the door. And at this point, he says, "How's that for an enthusiastic greeting?"
Yeah. So that's so
Then,
I
oh, yeah, go ahead.
well, I just think it's interesting that it takes almost a year for the next pounce to happen when, as we've been establishing, pouncing is such a huge part of Calvin and Hobbes.
Yeah, I agree that, and when you pointed that out, that struck me too, because like we say, that's one of the running gags in the strip. It becomes iconic. I think even the cover of one of the book collections has that. So yeah, if you think of Calvin and Hobbes, that's going to be an image that really comes to mind pretty quickly. So yeah, it's kind of surprising that it took that long. There's maybe one other semi example not too long after that one, and we can debate how much this counts, but this is at the bottom of page 93 in Something Under the Bed is Drooling. And there's a picture of Hobbes pouncing on Calvin coming out the door. So, a pretty classic image. But this was one of the sort of extra art only additions to some of the books. So, in a few of the early books, they have these at the bottom of the page. I don't think there's ever any dialogue on them. It's just art, but
Yeah.
it does show things happening from the strip. And so we can debate whether those count. And on that note, I guess in your opinion, Ryan, do we think those should be considered like canon events in Calvin and Hobbes, or
Yeah, I would call them canon in the same way that the bonus stories in the treasuries are canon, like, the transmogrifying into an elephant or the spaceman Spiff with the Nagan mothership. Those are canon. And
okay.
so, yeah, I would say these count. They didn't run in newspapers, and so I didn't count them in my list of numbers, but you could. I mean, I think it counts as Hobbes pouncing. There's just you can't really assign a date of publication to it.
Right, that makes sense. And when I mean canon, I don't just mean the Hobbes pouncing ones, but I mean like the additional sort of art
Yeah,
things in general, which I agree. I mean, I think even though they weren't in the newspapers, it makes sense to think, well, yeah, these are still things that happen in Calvin and Hobbes. I
it
think
was
one other I've mentioned for sure before had to do with storytelling. And
yeah.
so you see dad reading a story that looks like the ending of a classic fairy tale, oh, the happy prince and princess and animals. And then, well, dad thinks this is great. And Calvin's making this sort of disgusted expression about it. But
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's all canon. Watterson drew it. It
Okay.
was published. Yeah, I count it for
All
sure.
right. I counted too, I think.
Yeah. Now, the last instance of a successful pounce in Calvin and Hobbes is one where Calvin wakes up in the morning, crawls out of bed, and Hobbes jumps him and then runs off saying, "It's morning. Now we can do stuff again." And Calvin says, "It's hard to be mad at someone who misses you while you're asleep." Now, that's not the last time Hobbes attempts a pounce, but it's the last successful one.
And this one always struck me as especially heartwarming, seeing that. I mean, Hobbes doing it and then Calvin's reaction. And then it's also kind of interesting how it parallels a strip we've talked about before, the one where they talk about playing together in their dreams. So the idea we dream, so even when we're asleep, we can be together. And I believe you pointed out the more poignant sort of extra feature about this that even beyond the surface.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that Watterson drew that strip when Sprite, the inspiration for Hobbes, died. And he said we can always meet again in dreams. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean that brings it all together because without Sprite we wouldn't have Hobbes pouncing in the first place. And so yeah, I think those two strips connect really well.
Yeah, and I think and that's not something I ever really put together before or sort of connected, but I think that makes a lot of sense. It's almost like, it's two sides of the same coin. You get this sort of like this expression of joy in the idea of sort of overcoming loss or separation in this way.
Yeah. And then there's one more strip that kind of refers to Hobbes pouncing. So Calvin is poking his head outside and he hears a sneeze and he is able to get away and he says, "Hay fever season isn't all bad." And Hobbes says, "You think it's funny, but it's not." And I think that's an interesting last reference to pouncing strip that Hobbes is not successful in that one. But anyway, take that for whatever it's worth.
I wonder if do you think Watterson was specifically thinking of that as the last pouncing strip, or it just ended up that way?
Oh, man, I don't know. It's hard to guess because he knew the strip was ending, I
Mm.
believe, by the time that strip was published. Although I guess I don't know if he decided by the time it was drawn. But yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know either, but this was something I was kind of thinking of when we were doing the dad episode also. So I mentioned we were talking about like the last appearances
Hmm.
of dad, and I believe the very last appearance of him is like a bike riding strip.
Hmm.
And so it almost strikes me how sort of mundane that was compared to what we could have gotten for the last dad strip. Now we talked about how the like third from the last strip was a reference to building character, so that's more iconic.
Hmm.
But anyway, like with Hobbes here again, it's like Hobbes counting is such an iconic thing. It just makes me wonder, like, did Watterson intentionally say, okay, on this, this is what we're gonna have happen on the last pouncing strip, or did it just turn out that way? It's like, well, that's we've been doing the strip, and then it comes to an end, and
Yeah.
things are written as they've been written.
Yeah, I don't know because I know he's talked about how it can be difficult to come up with ideas and he even refers in strip to the idea of last minute panic being part of the process. And so I don't know if he was in last minute panic mode at that point, but it could have been, well, I have an idea, so here we go. you
Yeah.
know I don't know.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's just, and again, it's no way to really know, I guess, unless
Well,
Bill Watterson wants to come on our podcast and tell us, which I'll be sure to ask him if and when that happens.
right.
But
Yeah.
yeah, but yeah, I mean, because we talked about Rosalind, and the last strip there is when everything finally goes right. So
Right.
she uses the softer touch. Calvin doesn't immediately go on the offensive. He actually does his homework and agrees to play the game, and everything turns out okay. And it would make sense if that were intentionally the last Rosalind strip. Like Waterstone, okay, well here's the culmination of all this. We get this imaginative, exuberant young child actually being approached in a way that plays to those strengths, and then the night goes well instead of turning into a disaster. So I could see Watterson sort of intentionally thinking of this as here's the end of Rosalind's overall arc.
Yeah,
But
and I could see it with Hobbes too. I mean, because on the other side of the last minute panic coin is Watterson was often very intentional about what he was doing. You know, the things that you could see as just, oh, that's just how it happened, could very much be him having a pretty deep thought process about it. So, yeah, if we ever happen to get the chance to interview him, I'm not holding my breath, but hey, if it happened, we'll have to ask him about that sort of thing.
that's true. We
Yeah.
might have a few other questions too if that ever happens. But
Maybe one or two, yeah. So, okay, going back to pouncing. Sorry, listeners, we'll get there. Um,
hey, didn't we say there weren't going to be more digressions?
I don't remember saying that.
That's true.
Not,
I'm imagining that. Okay, moving
not
on.
like we have it recorded or anything for anyone to go check. But so coming back to the pouncing seems to stem from Hobbes viewing Calvin as prey. So you mentioned the one where Hobbes says you can take the tiger out of the jungle, but you can't take the jungle out of the tiger. And Calvin says the question is, how can you get the tiger back in the jungle? Or there's another one where Hobbes drops onto him from a tree and says something like, "You should be more alert. You wouldn't last 2 seconds in the jungle."
That's why I live here, you dolt.
Yeah. And there's one where Hobbes intentionally misses Calvin to show, according to Calvin, that he could have snuffed him. And then there's one where he complains about his prey, specifically, I believe, using the word prey, having little legs. And Calvin says, "Oh, I'm real sorry," because he says the thrill of the chase is diminished when his prey has little legs. And then the one that I mentioned a bit before, early man. Calvin is talking about what early man must have felt like gazing up at the stars and blah, blah, blah. And then Hobbes disappears. And then he pounces on Calvin and he says, "I bet that's what early man felt like, tiger food." So clearly, at least in some instances, Hobbes is being a tiger and viewing Calvin as prey.
Which makes a certain amount of sense
Yeah.
given his cat-like nature, and Calvin does kind of look like prey, admittedly. This is a bit of a side point, but I remember one time I was at a zoo and there was this small child standing right next to the glass next to a big cat enclosure. It wasn't a tiger, I believe it was a mountain lion. But man, that mountain lion was pawing at the
Ooh.
glass, opening its mouth. It's like, here's this enticing small morsel right here, and I can't get it.
Yep.
And it was a little bit scary, honestly, seeing that. I mean, the child was oblivious. She was facing the other way and whatever. But
I've seen the same sort of thing at zoos with my own kids, and it's a little terrifying. It's like, all right, let's go see the monkeys. You know?
yeah, yeah, kids might not be too bothered, but as a parent, that would be pretty hard to look at, I think. And
Yeah.
even me as a non-parent and having no idea who that little child was, it's like, that's disturbing seeing.
Yeah.
The other thing that Hobbes pouncing reminds me of in a weird way, this is kind of random, but have you ever seen the classic Pink Panther movies?
Oh, if I have, it's been a long time. I know what you're talking about, but I don't know them very well.
Okay, so I mean, I don't know them super well either, but one kind of running gag that happens in a lot of them is Inspector Clouseau has this, I guess we'll say, servant, employer, somebody,
Oh
but
yeah.
that he hires to randomly jump out at him and attack him to like keep his reflexes sharp.
Yeah.
So yeah, so he'll just be doing whatever, then all of a sudden they're like, yeah, and then they'll have this like silly fight scene, and like I don't know, but just prepping for this episode, it kind of reminded me of that because Calvin will just be doing whatever, minding his own business, and then randomly the tiger attack, and so you get this kind of parallel there.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I actually do remember that. I know I've at least seen clips of that from the Pink Panther. So yeah, that's a good parallel.
And as a kid, that was one of my favorite parts of those movies too. I always got a kick out of just
Yeah,
the
of course.
surprise fight scene. So
Right. So coming then to the when does Hobbes pounce, right? You talked about Calvin could be doing whatever. The iconic version of that, as we've said, is Calvin coming home from school, opening the door and saying, "I'm home," and then Hobbes blasts out the door and often knocks Calvin literally out of his socks and everything before he can even get in the door, usually accompanied by an onomatopoeia of pow or kapow. And then these usually end with some quip from Calvin and or Hobbes. Now, the first newspaper version that I found of this doesn't happen until almost 2 years into the strip in October of '87. So Hobbes hits him, and then Calvin says, "I wish I had a gerbil." But I will point out the one you say in Something Under the Bed is Drooling would have been, I don't know if it was published before that strip because I don't remember when the book was published,
Okay,
but it shows up in the books before the first POW strip. So,
that makes sense.
yeah. But there are others. So there are others before that where Hobbes attacks Calvin when he gets home from school, like a couple we've described. But the attack is either unsuccessful or it doesn't say "pow" and Calvin doesn't get launched. It's more like we said, Hobbes jumping on him from above and then they fight. But once we get to these "pow" strips, there's one where Calvin says he wishes he were a latchkey kid. There's one where mom catches him making prank calls, asking if pet stores will take his tiger. That one he actually gets attacked twice, once when he comes in the door and once in his room.
Then they go,
There's
not again.
yeah, there's one where Hobbes attacks him right at the door and says, "It's so darn quiet when you're not around." And Calvin says, "There's gonna be some ruckus now, buddy boy." And then one of my favorites, it's winter and Hobbes attacks him at the door and Calvin says, "Great, the snow cushioned the blow to my spine, so now I can die of pneumonia." Do you remember what Hobbes says?
Hmm. I forget actually. What does he say?
He says, "Oh, has you got these sniffles?"
Ouch, man, adding insult to injury there.
Yeah, sick burn, man. And then one where Hobbes attacks him out of nowhere. I don't think this one. No, this one is when he gets home from school, and he says, "If you ache, it's because you didn't stretch properly before exercising."
I didn't know I was going to be exercising.
Yeah. And then a couple more, just going through a quick list. There's one that I really like. It's one of the later Sunday strips. So we see like frame by frame slow motion of Hobbes getting closer and closer and Calvin realizing he's coming and turning around and running. And we see this great expression on his face as he gets launched into the air. And then Calvin says, "Do you ever notice how things slow down during a catastrophe?" And Hobbes says, "And the good times are always over so fast." And
I agree. That was one of my favorite, and I think in general, this is something Watterson does a few times. I really like the slow motion depiction of things because the art and the characters' expressions are always so fun in those. I mean, like you talked about, you gradually see, you know, the excited sort of, I don't want to say mean exactly, but sort of mean looking Hobbes getting closer and closer, and Calvin's look of panic changing from panel to panel there. Like those always really, I always get a kick out of those.
yeah, and I like to read that one twice whenever I come to it. I read it as slow-mo, and then when Hobbes says the good times are always over so fast, I like to go back and try to read it from Hobbes' perspective and look through the pictures really quickly.
Oh,
So,
that's fun.
yeah. And then one more that I'll just highlight because I like it. Hobbes hits Cal. So actually, let me back up. Before Calvin gets home, he says, "What a day. I feel like I've been run over by a train." And then pow! And Calvin says, "I mean, now I feel like that." And Hobbes says, "See, I told you you should always save hyperbole until you really need it."
That's good advice.
Yeah. So then this sort of thing, like you said, is the basis for the cover art on one of the books, The Essential Calvin and Hobbes specifically, which I think probably helped cement its status as an iconic feature of the strip because you get the cover of a book, Calvin's getting knocked out of his socks.
That's
And it
true.
also it also shows up on the back covers of at least one book, I think maybe a couple of them.
And we've talked about before, like how how enticing the book covers tend to be. And I mean, okay,
Yeah.
obviously, yes, we're running afoul of cliche, don't judge a book by its cover. That said, this is what we've talked about before. I think if I was not familiar with Calvin and Hobbes and I saw that book or I saw those covers, that would make me want to pick it up and see what it was. Like, I mean,
Yeah, for
so
sure.
yeah, so much. I mean, even the first one, like, you know, Calvin on the roller skates with the umbrella and then the wagon with Hobbs about to go in the lake, like
Yeah.
that.
What in
Weirdos
the
from
world
another
is
planet.
this?
Yeah, weirdos from another planet with a boy and the tiger afraid and the alien also afraid. Like, I don't know. So that's another example where I think if you just saw that, I wonder how many readers have been drawn in
Yeah.
particular by that sort of iconic image of Hobbes launching Calvin out the front door.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I'd be curious. I don't know how you could find out the answer, but I'd be curious to know what it is. But getting home from school is by no means the only scenario in which Hobbes pounces, even if it is the most iconic one. So, for instance, there are several where Calvin is by himself just playing with a truck when Hobbes pounces on him. And like one time he gets knocked out of his clothes, and his mom is like, I don't understand why you have to take your clothes off just to play toy cars. And he's like, just give them here, okay? And stuff like that. Um, I've got another little quiz for you. So, there's a couple involving a can opener. Can you think of what they are?
Okay, so two sort of instances of this come to mind. So there's one where Calvin's opening a can, and then Hobbes charges into him. We have kind of a pal moment, and he says something like, "If my senses don't deceive me, somebody opened a can of tuna in this vicinity." And then Calvin says, "Yeah, all over this vicinity," because now, of course, it's been knocked out. And that's one that I could especially imagine being like specifically inspired by Sprite or a cat. Like
Hmm.
cat comes running with the food, it like knocks it over by accident.
Yep.
So that's one. And then there's another one which is similar, and maybe it's an intentional callback even because you see Calvin starting to open the can, then you hear this rumbling sound. He goes, "Oh no!" So then Hobbs barrels into him. He goes, "It wasn't tuna, it was pineapple. See?" And Hobbs says, "All cans sound the same."
Yep. Yeah, those are the two that I found. And I think it probably is an intentional callback because they don't happen one right after the other, but they happen very close to each other. Like within a couple, I think on the same two pages.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So yeah, very good. And then there's some where he's just walking under a tree and Hobbes jumps him. There's one that I like where Hobbes has been trying to help him cure his hiccups, and Calvin's hiccups finally go away, and then Hobbes pounces into him and says, "Did I scare you? Did I cure your hiccups?" And Calvin's going hic hic hic. So
Oh, that's
he,
right. Because yeah, I think the hiccups had finally just gone away on their own, and then
yeah,
trying
yeah,
to cure them actually made them start again.
yes. And then a couple of times, Calvin will recite some tiger based poem while Hobbes is sleeping. That doesn't always result in pouncing, but in a couple of instances, Calvin finishes the poem, walks off, laughing to himself, and then Hobbes is either preparing to pounce or actually pounces into him.
Which is
So,
kind of funny because Hobbes forces Calvin to say poems about tigers to get up into the treehouse as the password. But when you get sort of the drive-by poeming effect, I guess we'll call it, where Calvin just spontaneously makes up maybe a less flattering verse about tigers on his own, then Hobbes gets irritated with him.
well, yeah, I mean, I think that's just it. They're less flattering. Like, is he asleep? To be perfectly frank, he looks more as if he were creamed by a tank and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, is that the same one that starts like, "My tiger, it seems, is running around nude. This fur coat must have made him perspire."
No, that's a different one.
Oh, that's a different. Okay,
Yeah,
so but
so
there are many times when this happens. Then
yeah, yeah. So the just because I love these, the first one is my tiger lies here so still and so flat. A question arises when glancing thereat. Is he asleep? To be perfectly frank, he looks more as if he were creamed by a tank. And then the other one, because I'm a dork, my tiger, it seems, is running around nude. This fur coat must have made him perspire. It lies on the floor. Should this be construed as a permanent change of attire? Perhaps he considered its colors passe, or maybe it fit him too snug. Will he want it back? Should I put it away, or use it right here as a rug?
which I gotta say, Calvin's pretty good with the lyrics and rhyme schemes.
Yeah. As a related note, Watterson said that he came up with a lot of these poems while watching his own cats sleep. So again, inspiration from Sprite and company.
That's right. Yeah, he says, I believe, that for whatever reason, seeing his cats inspires poetry from him.
Yeah. Poems spring to mind. Yeah. Now, we've been talking about successful pounces, but there are actually cases where Hobbes attempts to pounce on Calvin and it fails, or where Calvin attempts specifically to thwart Hobbes, sometimes successfully. So let's go through a couple of those. Occasionally, Calvin has used decoys to trick Hobbes, hoping those will get pounced on instead of himself. So there are varying degrees of effectiveness. There's one where he goes to a lot of effort. He goes in the
Oh,
garage, saws a broom, like makes a little dummy out of the broom, and Hobbes opens the door. So he puts the broom dummy there and says, "I'm home." And Hobbes opens the door and says, "Well, hello, Calvin. Do come in. May I read your comic books? I may. Why, thank you, Calvin. Can I draw funny mustaches on all the characters? I may. Oh, joy." And I love that one. And Calvin
And
is just
Calvin swears
furious.
revenge for this.
Yeah. And then there's another one where Calvin makes a dummy out of his lunch sack paper bag. So he somehow, stuffs it with leaves and stuff and puts his coat around. And so Hobbes pounces on that. And then he walks in with the messed up paper bag. And his mom says, "I don't know what the point is of you bringing your paper bags home if they're going to get all messed up like this." And he says, "That's what you think."
It's kind of
So that,
interesting that that one works, but the broom one does not work.
yeah. And then there's one where he tries to get Susie to get, actually, there's a couple where he tries to get Susie to be pounced on. And it doesn't work in either case with that one.
Right. And do you know why it doesn't work?
So we have to talk about both of them. So in the first one that I'm thinking of, anyways, Calvin says that he'll give her a quarter to go to the door and yell, "I'm home." And she's like, "Okay." And she does it and nothing happens. And so he ends up having to pay her a quarter. And then he opens the door and Hobbes pounces on him. And he says, "I can always tell it's you by the bad smell."
That's
So,
right.
yeah. On that note, Hobbes comments on Calvin's smell more than once, but Hobbes also talks about the smells of specific things. So I'm curious if you can name Hobbes's words for the smells of fire and wet leaves.
Okay, let me think. I think so. Wet leaves, I want to say, have a snorky, brambish smell. Is that correct?
Those are the fire.
Oh, those are the fire. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Snorky and brambish are the fire. Wet leaves. I mean, I remember the strip you're talking about. I always remembered Snorky and Brambish.
Hmm.
Not sure I recall the other words.
Okay, so there's actually a third one for fire. So Calvin is saying he smells the fire. I think that someone is cooking specifically. And he says, "Isn't it weird that we have these smells, but we don't have words for them?" And Hobbes says, "Oh, I don't know. I'd say that fire has kind of a snorky, brambish smell." And Calvin says, "I should have known animals would have words for smells." And then Hobbes says, "It's a little brunky, but the low humidity affects that." So
Okay.
three fire smells. And then in the next strip, Calvin says, "So what's the word for how wet leaves smell?" And Hobbes says, "Snipped." And then Calvin says, "What's the word for how I smell?"
And Hobbes says, terrible.
Yeah. So there's my connection to Hobbes talking about how Calvin smells. But I just wanted to bring those up. And then coming back to Susie, do you know the other one that he tries to get Hobbes to pounce on Susie?
So I believe this is when Susie has to stay at Calvin's house after school. And so at first, Calvin tries to prevent this and thinks it's a disaster. Then he realizes what might happen and he thinks it's going to be great. But instead of pouncing, Hobbes appears at the door in a tie.
What's with the tie? You
He
dressed up
dressed
for a
up for a
girl?
girl. Yeah. Which is not the first time. This is on brand for Hobbes because when they go to Susie's birthday party, he also wears a tie.
Yes. So I don't know why Calvin is surprised. But yeah, those are the two cases where that I can think of where he tries to get Susie to get pounced on and it doesn't work in either case. There's also, I'm changing gears here, but there's a couple of strips where as a decoy Calvin uses articles of clothing. So again, I'll put you on the spot. What articles of clothing does Calvin use to avoid getting pounced on?
Okay, so I think there's one strip where Calvin is sitting in kind of a recliner or an easy chair, and he takes a shoe and drops it on the floor. Then we see Hobbes snatch it, but of course, Calvin isn't actually in it. And I think
Yeah.
Hobbes is like, "That was a dirty trick."
Uh-huh.
That's one. And there's another one where I think he's about to go like around the corner of a hallway, and he waves his jacket or his shirt,
Hmm.
and then Hobbes pounces on that, and Calvin's like, "I bet some kids go around corners without even thinking about it."
Yep. And Hobbes said, I think, yeah, that might be where Hobbes says that was a dirty trick. It's one of those two.
Oh, maybe
Um,
the other one he might say like cheater or something with
yeah.
the shoe. Okay.
Yeah. One of them is cheater and one's that's a dirty trick. I get them mixed up. But there's one other where Calvin tosses his shoes around the corner and Hobbes
That's
pounces on those. And then we see Calvin and his mom in a shoe store, and she's saying, how do you wear out your shoes so fast? And Calvin says, I lead a rugged life. So several
that's
attempts there. There are a few where Calvin legitimately thwarts Hobbes, but then pays for it. So there's one where he opens the door as he comes home from school and dives to the floor as Hobbes is sailing past him. And then Calvin says, ha, stupid tiger. And Hobbes is jumping back in, and he says, elapsed turnaround time, 0.8 seconds.
I always liked in that one Hobbes' expression as he realizes what happens too, because you see him like at the same time going by, but also sort of looking back and being surprised / panicked about it.
And I believe he even says, yeah, uh-oh. There's one where Calvin is getting home and then he's like, oh, I bet Hobbes is waiting to pounce on me. I know, I'll sneak around behind him. So he sneaks through the back door, comes up behind Hobbes and yells right in his ear, I'm home. And Hobbes freaks out. But then Calvin is walking off all beat up. And then I don't know if this one exactly counts, but there's one where Hobbes is dreaming and Calvin is talking to him, says, what are you dreaming about? And Hobbes goes, I'm going to pounce on Calvin. And then Calvin yells, run for your life, Calvin. And he gets beat up in that one. And then a really good one, in my opinion, he's opening the door. He sneaks around again, but this time he manages to open the door from the inside. And then as Hobbes jumps out, Calvin slams the door closed and then knock, knock, knock. And he says, forget it, you moron. You can just wait out there all night. And it's his mom at the door with a bag of groceries, Hobbes sitting next to her. And she's like, I can't wait to hear this one explained.
Which is also great too, because from Calvin's perspective, like of course Hobbes was the one knocking. There's no reason why Hobbes couldn't knock on the door. So
yeah. And I mean, how did Calvin sneak past Hobbes to get to the door from the inside in the first place? That's what you gotta wonder.
yeah, this one arguably is the most impressive because it's like he had to do a really good job of stealthily getting to the door and either passing Hobbes or at least passing his sight line somehow. So I
Yeah, I
guess
don't know.
maybe
Maybe there's
Hobbes
like
is
a
just
side
laser
hall.
focused. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be tunnel vision. That was
Yeah, but it's like, man, that's pretty impressive that he managed to pull this off. And it is interesting that, as you alluded, Calvin does successfully / temporarily successfully pull off thwarting Hobbes at least some of the time.
yeah, because like in the snowball in the winter episode, we said he pretty much never beats Hobbes. Like we discovered one instance where he hits Hobbes with a snowball, but he pays for that. But
Mm-hmm.
with pouncing, Calvin actually wins a couple of times. So I think my personal favorite is one of the first ones. Calvin just walks up to the door and says, I am home. And then the door rattles and we see this wham. And then I love Hobbes is just sitting there with his hands on his head. Calvin says, you'll notice I didn't say I was inside. And that's the end of that strip. So presumably Calvin wins that battle.
Yeah.
And then there's one where I don't think Calvin is necessarily intentionally meaning to thwart Hobbes, but Hobbes is pouncing on him, and Calvin bends down and says, wow, a dime. And Hobbes kind of turns the failed pounce into a somersault. And Calvin says he would just love for me to think that somersault was completely intentional.
Yeah, he
And
walks off with this really kind of like dignified / snooty expression on his face too.
yeah, I think he like licks his paw first, even.
Yeah, especially cat-like.
Yes. And then one other, Hobbes is charging at him. Calvin jumps out of the way, and Hobbes tries to turn but slips on the like wood or linoleum floors or whatever, and crashes into the wall or the cabinet or something. And Calvin says, Mom blames me for these scuffed up floors. And Hobbes says, I wish your parents would take up these floors and put down some sod.
Which that would be an interesting way to have a house, I guess. Have
Yeah.
sod or grass or something.
I don't know about that. Yeah, that would be interesting for sure.
Yeah, I mean, fun for tigers, but maybe not for human beings.
Yeah. Now, there are also some cases where the roles are a little different. So there's one case where Calvin actually helps Hobbes pounce on something. You remember specifically?
Isn't it toast and jam?
Yeah, yeah. He spreads the jam on the toast and hucks it down the hall, and then Hobbes pounces on it and says that it's much more fun that way, basically. And then Calvin is being taken to clean up the floors from all the jam that got everywhere. And he says, "But mom, it's their nature." So there's that one. There's one where Calvin pounces on Hobbes. You want to describe that one for us?
Yeah, so this one, I think this also falls into the category of Calvin pays for it afterwards because I think Hobbes is asleep, kind of laying on his
Mm-hmm.
back. And then all of a sudden, I think from out of frame, we see Calvin, yeah, and jump through the air. But of course, then Hobbes opens his mouth to reveal his teeth and has all his claws out on his four paws. And so Calvin, tries unsuccessfully to abort this in midair,
Yep.
and then it doesn't go well. And well, I always forget that 5 of his 6 ends are pointy when he lays like that.
Yeah. And I love that. I like the description of Hobbes as having six ends because I don't usually think of animals that way, but it's true. He's got
Yeah, I mean, especially
this.
when you count the tail.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, 5 of his 6 ends are pointy. And speaking of trying to abort a pounce in midair, this one I kind of fits here. It winds up being a successful pounce, but Calvin is just playing by himself, and then he kind of gets this expression and says, "No one better be sneaking up on me," and then Hobbs just falls directly on top of him, and it says "whoomp," and he says it's hard to change direction in midair. So
That's true.
yeah, I
Yeah,
love that
I
one.
think that counts as a pounce.
Yeah, it does, but it's just a little different. And then a couple where Hobbes doesn't pounce, but he still scares Calvin. There's one where Calvin is really nervous and looking for Hobbes, expecting to get pounced at any moment. And then he finds Hobbes and says, "Oh, there you are." And Mom observes that Calvin hasn't been looking well. But then there's also one where Hobbes just sneaks up behind Calvin and then just gets in his business with this fierce expression on his face. And Calvin freaks out and is clutching his mom. And she says, "I think those comic books you read are probably too graphic."
Yeah, and this is one that I distinctly remember reading as a kid. I believe in the newspapers, and there's kind of two things interesting about this. One, after this, when he's clutching his mom at this point, you see too, yeah, the comic books he was reading are laying there, but so is Hobbes, like the stuffed animal version, innocently laying there.
Yeah.
And then
Yep.
when you look at this, yeah, Hobbes does look really scary in this one. Like it's right next to us, this like evil looking, kind of smiling, snarling expression. I'm like, geez, if I was Calvin, I would be freaked out too.
Yeah. If a tiger came up to me and did that, I think I would actually have a heart attack.
Yeah, I mean, just like I said, I remember reading it, even reading it as a kid, I'm like, good grief, how scary. Like, yeah, because
Yeah. That was,
usually we think, Hobbes, yeah, I mean, he's a little bit scary, but it's more just funny. This, he actually looks scary, and I always thought.
yeah. That one was pretty mean, I think, but also funny. So, Calvin is scared by these and he tries to tell his parents what happens with Hobbes. And so, like, there's a short story arc where Calvin gets pounced on and then he comes up to his dad and he says, "You know how Hobbes always pounces on me?" And his dad says, "No." And he's like, "Well, he does. So I made this mash to put on the back of my head." And, they do this in like India to so that tigers can't tell which way you're facing. So then they can't sneak up. And he tells his mom about it too, and she doesn't buy it. And then he tells Hobbes about it. You remember what happens there?
So he gloats about this, I believe. He's like,
Uh,
oh, now you can't tell which way I'm facing. This will teach you that people are smarter than animals. But he's standing so close to him that Hobbes just, like, I think practically swallows his head.
yes.
Yeah, he like half swallows him. And then Calvin's like, no fair, you didn't sneak up.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's the one that starts off the Stupendous Man slash Rosalind story arc that we've talked about before, where Hobbes pounces on him. And then the next strip, Calvin says, "I got this dirty just trying to come in the front door," because Hobbes was lying in wait.
Yeah, which raises a kind of funny point. It's like you mentioned, he tries to tell his parents, well, you know how Hobbes always pounces on me? And no. And it's like, from Calvin's perspective, that's like, what do you mean no? This happens all the time. Like, you don't? Well, yeah, he does. Like,
Yeah. Well, and in this final bid to convince his parents of what's happening, he brings a camera in his lunchbox, like a Polaroid camera. And as Hobbes is pouncing on him, he snaps a picture and then gets knocked out of his socks. And then he shows the picture to his dad. And he's like, see, that's what he does when I get home. And dad doesn't buy it.
Yeah, and this is one of my all-time favorite strips, actually. I mean, both because it's the iconic pouncing, but it's Calvin unsuccessfully trying to explain to everyone else, no, it's Hobbes that did this, because it is kind of a running theme throughout the strip that Calvin will say, oh, I didn't do such and such, it was Hobbes.
Yeah,
And not all the time, but a lot of time it's true. But of course, no one ever blames Hobbes for anything. It's like, you too were doing this.
yeah.
But I
Well,
love
you
this
were the
too.
one playing the cymbals.
Yeah, that was even one of the very first strips even has this happening. So that's a long running theme. So we get kind of the combination of both of those here. And I love because you see him take the picture, but then you see what the dad sees in the Polaroid, and it's
Uh-huh.
the stuffed version of Hobbes maybe sailing through the air. But
Right. He's
then
in the air.
yeah. And so you remember what dad says about this.
Well, so dad claims that Calvin tossed him into the air, but I think it's Hobbes's reaction to this that
Yes.
really
He thinks you threw me in the air. I've never been more offended in my life.
yep. And Calvin's like, I gotta get a video camera.
Yeah,
So
so this is definitely one of my favorite pouncing strips, and probably one of my favorite overall Calvin and Hobbes strips.
yeah. Also, incidentally, it's not the only case where Calvin takes pictures of Hobbes and then shows them to his dad.
That's
So
true.
the other one, I don't think these are Polaroids, but Hobbes is like making funny faces and stuff, and then Dad's like, more pictures of Hobbes, and Calvin says, aren't they a scream? Can you give me $10 for another roll of film? And Dad's looking at all these pictures of just stuffed Hobbes just sitting there.
Yeah, but to Calvin, it's all the hilarious faces Hobbes is making.
Yeah. All right, last thing to cover. So we've said this right from the beginning, even though there's this sort of, I don't know if we should call it animosity or, something that,
Irritation.
yeah, irritation. That's a good word of from Calvin's perspective of being pounced on. In some ways, he seems to kind of enjoy it or expect it, or at least associate it with affection. So there's one that we mentioned back in episode 2 where he says, I'm home, I'm home, I'm home, and nothing happens. And then he goes up to his room and Hobbes is just sitting on the bed. And Calvin's like, well, and Hobbes says, so you're home. So, he's like, why did you pounce? Um, and then the one that
You
you mentioned,
care?
yeah, don't what's going on, Hobbes? Yeah, but then there's the one that we mentioned where he gets pounced on after a really terrible day at school and he's walking home in the rain and Hobbes pounces him and Calvin's upside down and Hobbes is just hugging him in the rain. And then Calvin, that's the catalyst for him to say the day is getting better after getting beat up by Mo and doing terrible in class and getting rained on. And I think he missed the bus and, just all these bad things.
Like everything you could imagine going wrong at school goes wrong.
Yeah, and Hobbes pouncing is what makes his day better. And then the one we said where Hobbes pounces on him, this is the last successful pounce. And then he says, it's morning, now we can do stuff again. And Calvin says, it's hard to be mad at someone who misses you while you're asleep. So, despite all the ruckus and the fighting and everything, like we've said before, Calvin and Hobbes are best friends, and this is a matter of affection in a
It
lot of
is.
ways.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of the most, we've used the word iconic a lot, but I think it's appropriate. One of the most iconic images and themes from Calvin and Hobbes, and it really kind of encapsulates their relationship. Like they do sort of play pranks and antagonize each other, but at the end of the day, it's all out of love and affection. And when it's not happening, they even miss it sometimes, no matter how irksome it might seem in the moment.
Yeah, exactly. Now, before we wrap up, just to give one last chance for each of us to say any others that we might have missed. Are there any other Hobbes pounding on Calvin strips that are just favorites that you want to shout out?
So this one, it's another aspect of his parents' reactions and just not understanding or knowing what happened. So he gets pounced on at the door as usual. Then he comes in and his mother says something like, "What did you do? Step on a landmine?" And so no matter what Calvin does, and then Susie has this reaction sometimes too. Like so Calvin gets pounced on and they're like rolling around fighting, and Susie's like, what are you doing? You didn't even change out of your school clothes.
Yeah.
He said something like, it's not my fault. This murderous psycho tried to pounce on me or something. And this may be one where I don't know if it's the same one or not, but Susie's trying to argue. It's like, but he's just sitting there. It's like, oh, big disguise. The tiger's just sitting there. That really hides his murderous intent.
Yep. And Susie is very confused and walks off. And what does Calvin say? He's like, hang on, I gotta look this one up.
Sure.
Yeah, you're right. He says, "Oh, sure, big disguise, like no one can fathom the savage mind of a jungle cat. Ha! He's a killer to the core." And Susie says, "I wish my parents would move. My diary is getting weirder every day." And then
That's
Calvin
right.
says, "Yeah, you know who I'm talking about. Wipe that grin off, or I'll do it for you." Back to his interaction with Hobbes.
That's actually not the only time Susie makes a reference potentially moving. I don't think this relates to pouncing, but Calvin does, something to her, and then she comes in the house. Any chance of getting transferred, Dad?
Yeah, it happens a couple of times. And let me see, a couple of others that I'll bring up. So one of the earlier ones, when Hobbes pounces, he says, "I like." Right before he pounces, we see this that it's going boing, and then he says, "I read that tigers' spinal columns are like big coiled springs," and Calvin says, "I read that their brains are like big bowls of tapioca," which I just think is a great insult.
That is a good insult.
Yeah, and let me see, I already said the one about dying of pneumonia when the snow cushioned the blow to his spine.
There's one more that comes to mind for me. So one I don't think we mentioned, but I really like, and this falls into the category again of Calvin at least attempting to thwart the pouncing. So you see him sitting there kind of playing with a truck, as you mentioned, this happens sometimes.
Oh yeah.
He kind of looks around, and he moves a little ways away, and he starts playing again. Well, then Hobbes pounces on him, and he says, "You moved upwind, silly. Man, human senses aren't worth a hill of beans." So
Yeah. Oh,
yeah,
and I
so
like,
Calvin seen this in a nature documentary, but unsuccessfully applied the knowledge.
yeah. I don't know why this made me think of it, but there's one where Calvin gets home from school, realizes Hobbes is probably going to pounce, sits on the front step for a little while until he hears snoring from inside the house. And then he opens the door and Hobbes pounces on him and then says, "Cat nap. Noun, a quick light doze in the manner of cats." And Calvin's like, "I know what it means." So I just like this. It's another unsuccessful attempt to thwart Hobbes that I enjoy.
That's true. Actually, in one other successful attempt that comes to mind, there's one where he comes home from school and he says something like, "Mom, I'm home. Can you open the door
Oh,
for me?"
yeah.
And then, this happens, and she's like, "Why can't you open it yourself?" And then Hobbes is like, "That's cheating," or something.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and then he can only do that one once because then his mom's like, "Well, don't make me come to the door unless it's locked," or something like that.
Right, which actually raises an interesting point. So you mentioned before there's the one where Calvin says, "Oh, sometimes I wish I were a latchkey kid." But why would that help? Like
Yeah,
if he uses a key to open the door, he's still coming in and Hobbs can pounce on him. So unless I'm missing something, I don't see how that would do him any good.
yeah, yeah. I don't know how that would help. Well, we'll just add that to our list of questions if we ever get to interview Bill Watterson.
Okay. That one might
Yeah.
not be the most urgent of the questions, but
Okay.
I'm not
Hey,
saying it can't go on the list, just
yeah, that'll be further down. Yeah. So, listeners, what are your favorite instances of Hobbes pouncing? If you feel so inclined, let us know. You can always email us at magiccandh@proton.me. That's magiccandh@proton.me. And there will be a link in the show notes. And we would love to hear from you.
and remember, this is a completely free podcast and a completely ad-free podcast. This is all about just having fun celebrating this joyous strip. So come along and celebrate with us.
Yes, absolutely. Come along. Let's go exploring. You've been listening to The Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. We'll be releasing 40 episodes all throughout the year, from November 18th, 2025 to November 18th, 2026, to celebrate the 40th anniversary. Our intro and outro music is Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, referenced in the Calvin and Hobbes strip published on October 8, 1986. This rendition was performed by the Skidmore College Orchestra and made available under a Creative Commons license on museopen.com. We hope you'll join us next episode for more fun.